right, it is my pleasure to now introduce Mr. Fancy Tie Jeff Johnson. That tie is very distracting, I love it. Jeff Johnson is the director of our Office of the Procurement Executive's Federal Assistance Division, and he's going to come and talk to us today about the new Super Circular! Woo!
There's nothing more thrilling than talking about regulations at the end of the day, right? It is the funnest thing that I can think of doing, and that's why I enjoy this job. As when I was invited, and Kat invited me to speak, I kind of was thinking, what should I talk about? How many of you are aware of the Omni Circular, the Super Circular that's coming at the end of this year? Okay, so quite a few hands. That's good. And since this is a bidders conference, I was just recently in Chicago, and I was on a vacation. They do let us out sometimes to have some free time, and we went to what used to be the Sears Tower to visit it, and they have this thing called the Ledge. How many of you have heard of the Ledge? Yeah. So this is a lot like applying for a grant. First off, you're thinking, oh my God, we need to go all the way to the top to get this thing. And then you get up to the top and you're writing your proposal and you're looking out over the landscape and you're saying, I don't know why anybody would not fund this proposal because this is the best proposal ever. Look at this, just like this view over Chicago. It's gorgeous. And then we come to the Ledge. And the Ledge is this 4.5 foot clear box that sticks out over the edge of the 113th floor, I think it is, 103rd floor. And you get in this line to go up to the Ledge. And everyone's jovial, talking, but as you get closer to the Ledge, just like winning an award, people get quieter, they get a little bit more nervous, and then comes that moment when, oh my, I don't know if I can do this. And you know that there's supports. You know that this has been engineered to hold people and hold weight, and there's been millions of people that have stood on there. But there's a good chance that a 6'5", 250-pound man is not going to be able to stand out on this ledge. So those are my shoes. And that's my wife. A lot of people notice my wife's shoes and say, wow, she's got really nice shoes. But all I saw was those cars are mighty small down there, and I hope this holds. And it's a lot like what you feel when you're doing a grant program. You are stepping out onto a ledge, and that is the purpose and the intent of these new regulations, to provide you with some supports in what you're doing. I used to be a social studies history teacher, so I'm going to give you some quotes. This is all I could come up with in the short time I had to prepare for this. So Aristotle, let's go all the way back. And believe me, this will all connect back to grants. It's the mark of an educated mind to rest satisfied with the degree of precision which the nature of the subject admits, and not to seek exactness where only an approximation is possible. That goes to writing a proposal. You are not writing exactly what you're going to provide. You're trying to get as close as possible as you can with your cost proposal and with the structure that you're putting in place with the objectives. But again, it is an approximation. And if a man gives no thought about what is distance, he'll find sorrow at hand. So you have to think about what is the outcome and the objective that they're looking for in DRL programs before you apply for the grants. It's also the little details that are vital. Little things make big things happen, and we have to remember all those details, all those little steps create the programs and the projects that leads to successful programs and support of the department's mission. And this is for the government side too. All the exaggerations are right if they exaggerate the right things, right? If you're doing your program reports and you're exaggerating and not focusing on the things that are going wrong, we need to know what could possibly go wrong. Not every project is going to be perfect and meet the objectives that we anticipated. And as my mom always said, recipes exist to get ideas, not to be followed to the letter. And our proposals are not necessarily exactly following. It's not like a contract where I say, I want 10 computers, and I expect 10 computers, and I'm going to count 10 computers and receive that, and I'm going to pay you for 10 computers. We're anticipating that you meet an objective. And, being a history teacher again, and to talk about recipes, my mom loves to bake. She's a pie maker, she loves pies, and there is one way that you cut a pie, right? You slice it in a triangle, and the first piece is always much bigger than the rest of the pieces, and then you get this misangled, and it's not always even, and if you have 4 or 5 brothers and sisters like I do, and you get into fights about who has the largest slice. But is there a better way to slice a cake? This is where I want you to say something. Is there a better way to slice a cake? Yes. So, at the turn of the century, the last century, not this century, now I'm showing my age, the turn of the last century, there was a cookbook that came out that showed the best way to cut a piece of cake so that everyone, or pie, that everyone gets the same size slice. And this is what you're doing with your proposals. You are looking at different ways. Don't just follow the same approach that has been done before. You should look at innovative ways and innovative approaches. That's why we give points, or DRL provides points for those proposals that have greater emphasis on certain groups. It's pretty neat, eh? Slice it down the middle, close it, it stays moist, it stays nice. Okay, now we get to the boring stuff. Implementing OMB. So OMB has what's called 2 CFR, the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 200. And what they've done is they've taken several regulations, about 8 of them, and combined it into one large regulation. So they've taken all the regulations for audits, the regulations for hospitals, the regulations for states, the regulations for nonprofits, the cost principles for all of those also, and combined it into one large document. And that started about 4 years ago. And it was a process that was used where we talked to the community and brought together all the players to put together an approach, a wiser approach, a 21st century approach to grant making. And so last December, December 26th, Boxing Day, OMB's Christmas present to all of us, the new regulations were released. And OMB said, we've taken 4 years to figure this out, you have 1 year to implement it. And it's not only implemented within the department, but all of the recipients will be responsible for implementing this beginning December 26th of 2014, when this goes final. So on December 26th, 2014, all federal agencies at the same time will release a Federal Register notice. Everybody knows what Federal Register is, right? It's a public vehicle for us to display and talk about current regulations. Regulations have the full effect of law. And on December 26th, we will rescind our current regulations, and we will implement these new regulations. So, Part 200 is OMB, Part 600 is Department of State. Every agency, including AID, HHS, and so on, have their own part. Our part is 600. We will accept the new regulations and the new processes. And this is where all of the different portions are. So the first thing they have is acronyms and definitions. The first time the federal government in the grants-making world has agreed to definitions. So now if you have a grant with USAID, or you have a grant with CDC, or you have a grant with agriculture, the definitions will be the same. The terminology will be the same as it is at Department of State. And I thought this was an easy process. We had 99 common definitions. And I go to the first meeting a couple years ago, and the first term that we put out on the table was the date of award. I thought, wow, this is going to be pretty easy. This is going to be smooth sailing. Date of award, everyone knows that's when a grants officer or a authorized official of the U.S. government signs the award. Done. Let's move on to the next definition. Another agency raised their hand and said, no. The date of award is when their budget office obligates the funds. And then another agency raised their hand and said, no. It's the date the recipient signs when you sign the award and countersign the grants officer's signature. Whoa. So now we're going to have a conversation about the date of award. We're confused at agencies, and you are going to be confused because every agency is implementing it differently. And that seems like a small thing, but the date of award affects the date you can begin charging against the award. It affects record retention dates. It affects a whole host of other things. And we finally came down to a decision, and the decision of the date of the award is what? I heard a grants officer say that. What is it? Right, it's the date the grants officer signed it. But we went through 99 of these discussions. And now with the passage of the Data Act. Anybody heard of the Data Act? Good, I see one hand, a couple hands. The Data Act is another portion. So a lot of this collection and data that's being submitted and collected by the US government requires definitions. So now they'll have common definitions across budget, across grants, and across contracts. So we want to have common definitions across all three areas. They broke it into other areas of general provisions, pre-award, post-award, cost principles, and so on, and I'll talk a little bit about those changes. The first objective of these new regulations is to reduce the administrative burden on you, the recipients. That there should be a consistent approach of all agencies. When you see a notice of funding opportunity, an announcement, an RFA, it should be in the same format, in the same standard set of information for every grant, no matter what the agency is. Every award should have the same data sets as every other agency. We wanted to improve the integrity of financial management and the operations of federal programs by focusing more on objectives and focusing more on reducing some of the issues that we've seen within grant programs. We also wanted to reorient recipients toward achieving program objectives. Program objectives are the intent of any grant program. So we came up with 99 common definitions, and these are just some of the information. It is a fascinating read, and you should really take some time to read it. There's a standard set of definite data elements. Agencies are now required to post their awards for 60 days. Agencies can reduce that to 30 days, and in some circumstances have less than 30 days. But the intent of that is to give all recipients or all applicants an opportunity to fully develop an application and be competitive with their applications and have understandings of what the intent of the applications are. They've defined what subrecipients are as compared to subcontracts. And this goes a long way to resolving some common issues we've seen of determining what is that organization's intent under the program. Is it to support meeting the goals and objectives, or is it a service or a product being purchased under the program? They added for you, the recipients, if you have subrecipients, you have a tremendous amount of new work to do. This was not in the prior regulations. You're now required to do a risk assessment of every subrecipient that you provide funds to. You're probably already doing that. But you need to formalize that approach and how you're going to ensure that you've established a risk leveling for that organization. You also have to be responsible for ensuring that reports are done on time and so on. And the intent of this is to reduce administrative burden for recipients. I'll get to the bear claw in a second. They've also reduced or changed and modified many of the cost standards, and that was to make it more programmatically focused. One thing that we do not allow, and I don't know how many of you have tried to purchase it before, but is alcohol is an unallowable cost. We tried that. We tried to say it was culturally appropriate to have wine and beer at some events, but they still said that that's against the regulations. But for conferences and meetings and so on, there is an allowability for food and drink and not have a working meal if it's programmatically necessary. Same thing with entertainment costs. There's some changes to travel restrictions. There's an allowability for childcare costs. If you're having a conference for women and empowering women, you could cover the cost of childcare for the single mothers that may be coming to that conference. You may also, what am I trying to say? There is some allowabilities for VAT, fluctuations in exchange rates. All those have become allowable costs. So we've incorporated a tremendous amount of international programming into the regulations, which were never there before, to allow you to have an opportunity to reclaim some of those costs that are programmatically necessary. And if they're programmatically necessary, they should be allowable costs. We've also allowed for reporting to be more than just quarterly, if it's programmatically necessary. If you set up an activity-based program, the government can say, we don't want reports to be quarterly. We can say that we want it at the end of the activity because it makes more sense. Does that make sense? Yeah. There's some changes to indirect costs and some allowabilities for your NICA rates, that you can keep your NICA rates for an extended period of time. If you've never had an indirect cost rate agreement with the federal government, you're allowed a flat rate of 10% until you get an indirect cost rate agreement. There's changes to the A133 requirements, the audit requirements for US-based firms, where they've increased the bar from $500,000 to $750,000. So there's some changes, and the audit requirement will kick in December of next year. So if you're one of the A133 audits, you need to talk to your auditors about those changes. Also, your procurement clause. So you have, remember I was talking about subrecipient and subcontract? If you are using subcontracts, this is what you have to follow. You need to have micro purchases, small purchases, sealed bids, competitive proposals, sole sources. All of these need to be within your organization's policies and procedures. You have to have policies and procedures on how you're acquiring your goods and the approaches that you will be taking with those. One of the things that I failed to mention was with your subrecipients, if you have subrecipients, you are allowed to do fixed price awards to your subrecipients, up to $150,000. So instead of doing a cost basis, you can say that this service was $50,000 and you're allowed to pay them $50,000 and not have to pay them based on the specific amount of funds that they received. But you need to have controls built into your system to make determinations of fixed price. Okay, so at the same time that these new regulations are coming up, the department also has had some GAO and IG reports about the way that we do our processes here. And I just want to make you aware of that because there is the regulations that are changing, but there's also internal processes that will be modified and changed over the next year. Some of the things they talked about was uncoordinated grant program creation, need for better collaboration, some internal control weaknesses within the Department of Systems, and also a lack of agency or recipient capacity of trying to do too much with too little and not having the resources or the ability to monitor and oversee and ensure that we get what we'd asked for. How much more time? Okay. So I just want to take you through some of the steps that the department requires of the 4 stages of an award. You have pre-award, award, post-award, closeout. All of us follow those same stages. We have certain things that we're doing, and you have certain things that you're doing. We announce an opportunity. We do that on grants.gov. We receive the application, review, and make the decisions. You're on the other side, finding the opportunities, coming to conferences like this, submitting your application, doing a status review, and then during the award notification, we're establishing the terms and conditions of the award, building out that, negotiating the budget, and so on. You're receiving the notification of award, you're countersigning that, ensuring that you understand all the terms and conditions. When the new Omni circulars come, you will have a different grant document than you currently have. It'll be a much shorter and simpler format than before. Your process, at the same time that we're dispersing payments, we're managing and overseeing, we're doing site visits, we're reviewing program reports, we're doing regular daily communications. You're also requesting payments through PMS or through other systems, performing your award requirements and submitting your reports in a timely fashion. And then what is vitally important is closeout. You are required to submit your final report 90 days after the end of the period of performance. And once you submit your final financial report, the clock begins for you to get your records disposition. You have 3 years after that date that you can retire all records by regulation for those programs, unless there's an audit or a review going on. I just want to focus on a couple areas where you are, you have some key compliance points. One is when you sign that 424. When you sign that application, when your authorized official signs that, that you are agreeing to comply with all federal requirements and prudent management of the expenditures. And every submission that you make after that point must be signed by an authorized official. We've seen a lot of awards recently where someone other than an authorized official of the organization is signing either program reports or financial reports or even the 424. And every request for payment is a certification that you have complied with all the material requirements and terms of the award. And these are just some of the certifications that you sign. The 1909, which is the cover page of your grant agreement. The FFR, your financial report. All of those are certifications to us in the government that you are doing what is right and appropriate with the funds that you've been provided and that you're meeting the goals and objectives of the program. So they're vitally important to us to understand how you're performing under the grant and that you are certifying that I am doing it. So this becomes, it feels like sometimes a paperwork chase. But it all has importance because we have to understand and have knowledge of what you're doing and how you're doing it and how you're helping us meet the department's goals. So I'll just quickly go through risk assessment and then I'll stop for any questions. But you're required to do risk assessments of all your subrecipients. You should be doing a risk assessment of everything you do. You should be doing a risk assessment of whether I should even apply for a grant program, whether you do that formally or informally. And I always like this sign just because it's funny. And this sign has sharp edges. Do not touch the edge of the sign. Also, the bridge is out ahead. When you do a risk assessment, you need to be assured that you're assessing the appropriate things. If you're looking this way and all the risk is over here, you are not helping yourself. So you need to identify the areas of risk. What are the categories of risk? You have programmatic risk. You have, if you're using subrecipients, you have organizational risks of dealing with the other organization. You have a response that you have to do after you assess the risk level. And the goal is not to eliminate all risk. That's absurd. We can never get rid of all risk. Every moment is a risk. Coming here to speak to you was a risk. But I tried to mitigate it through humor and a bow tie. But a lack of internal controls and the mitigation of those risks is vitally important, because if your eyes are not open to the risks, that's when we have troubles. And that's when we see front page of the Washington Post. How could you have not known? If any of you saw last week, there was a Fox News article about the Department of State and about grant making at the Department of State that was not flattering to the way that we do business. And part of the new approach is that we have to do a risk assessment, and our recipient community has to do a risk assessment to ensure that we are mitigating for all possibilities of any issues occurring that could adversely affect us. And we are looking at two things. We're looking at loss avoidance, so we're trying to assure that we're avoiding any risk. And we're also preparing for any type of risk in case something bad occurs. And not all risk is bad. There's some good risk. And these are some of the strategies that you can put into place: acceptance, avoidance, transference, mitigation. And we also have to acknowledge the fact that everything has an inherent risk. When we put the control in place, when we identify and respond to a risk assessment, we also have to assume that there's residual risk that we can never get rid of. And we have to accept there's certain things. If I'm doing programming in Afghanistan, I am going to have a certain level of risk that I can never mitigate for. I cannot get rid of that. I have to either accept it or not do the programming there. So, any questions? That's a lot. Homework assignment, read the circular. All 800 pages of it, yes. Okay, all right. Well, thank you.